Hi, I'm Dr. Rupinder Oberoi, and I teach at University of Delhi, Department of Political Science. One of the paper which I've been teaching for quite some time is public administration and public policy. And what I've seen is that there is a growing interest of the students to understand what is public policy, what are the processes, and also to get to know about the whole dynamics of policy making. And just like any other university, which has now separate programs of public policy and governance, we also in Delhi University have separate papers which are talking about public policy, public administration, and also moving on to what is governance, what is good governance, what are the policy making processes, what are the issues involved, and what are the stakeholders. So when we have to talk about public policy, we need to understand that public policy is essentially a device employed to meaningfully address some of the wicked or stubborn social, economic, or political problems. Public policy is also reflected in what the government wants to achieve. So very often when we define public policy, we say it's an authoritative allocation of values. And even though we give a lot of credence and, we in common society as citizens believe that public policy is largely emanating from the government, the truth is that there is a lot of dialectics which plays at the back room of policy making. And there are multiple stakeholders involved in the policy making. In fact, I would go on to say that a good policy actually takes care of involving and engaging the diverse stakeholders who have an interest in the policy. So to put it very simplistically, public policy is an instrument, a tool to achieve or guide the social action in a very coherent way. And when it is backed by the will of the state, it gets a lot of, the policy itself gets a lot of legitimacy and credibility. And it is assumed that large number of people in the society or community are going to accept that policy because it is coming from a legitimate institution called the state, and in democracy particularly because we have provided the mandate to the government to formulate a policy for it. So, this is a very simplistic assumption, but if we dissect a little deeper, policy making is also the power, there's a lot of power, ideological predilections involved in the policy making. And since policy making cannot be completely segregated from the politics, therein comes an issue of, the politicization of policy making itself. So you can ask yourself this question: is policy always neutral? Is policy always directed towards rational, optimum outcomes? And then you will realize that as you delayer these dynamics which plays out in the policy making, you will feel that policy making has many ideology, dialectical interaction, as I said, and also there are predetermined goals which are sought to be achieved through these processes. Primarily, when we talk about policy making, there are two types of stakeholders. Of course, there are state stakeholders, in which we include not only the government, but also large number of standing committees, expert committees, think tanks, who come into action whenever the policy is being written, legislated upon, or deliberated upon. But also there are non-state actors. And non-state actors are a large number of social actors, civil society organizations, NGOs, media, and lobbying groups, which also play a lot of a part in it may not be very visible, but they do play a significant role in what would be the final contour or the shape of the policy. So when we talk about in the contemporary parlance, we say that policy making is about involvement of larger number of stakeholders, so that when policy is actually formulated and actually implemented, it has the consensus, it has the backing of the community and the groups for which that policy is being framed. And once there is a backing and legitimacy and credibility of the policy, naturally the policy gets accepted, and the outcomes which the policy is seeking to achieve becomes more probable and possible. I mean, just imagine the friction which can emerge if the government is creating or formulating a policy, and the community or the segment of the society for which the policy is being made, that segment is not ready to accept that policy. You know, the latest Farms Bill is an example of this kind of a tussle between the policy formulation happening at the government and the bureaucratic level, and the non-engagement of the farmer community. This is kind of a debate which is currently happening. So just to provide you a reference about how this disjuncture between the policy formulation, agenda setting in institutions and the community can create a rift and a friction and create this kind of a gridlock and logjam where a lot of effort goes wasted because the community is not ready to lap up the efforts which the government sees or perceives to be good for them. So basically policy making, as I said, is a very, very dynamic process involving large number of stakeholders. And also policy making is a value dependent process because it engages the governed and the government, which are dialectically interlinked. And policy making is not also a single shot phenomena. Given the criticality of the policy, given the fact that it involves so many people, viewpoints, counter viewpoints, it is important that policy making is thoroughly debated and goes through various steps and processes which are again inbuilt in the system of policy making itself. So I mean, if I have to talk about very, very theoretically what is policy and what is policy making, then we have to sort of understand that policy making is about the general statement of priorities, written regulations, guidelines, procedures, or standards to be achieved. So this is, of course, a very simplistic term, but policy refers to a very, very distinct path of action, which is suitable for the pursuit of this desired goals within a particular context, directing the decision-making of an organization or an individual. So policy making is not just about what government does. It is in fact also about what government chooses not to do. So this is an interesting aspect of policy making also, that if the government decides not to take an action on a particular issue, that also is a policy stance of the government. So public policy is a course of action that guides this range of related actions in a given field. It's rarely, it really involves or engages clusters of entangled long-term problems. And policy making provides this guidance to the government and brings in the accountability and answerability or responsibility links to the citizens. So, and these decisions, as I said, are often clouded by values rather than purely by outcomes or objective data. And many issues tend to be, in fact, deeply involved in held values, interests, because there's a large amount of money involved. Making policy itself is a very, very convoluted, complex, multi-layered process. And the policy making process is actually about balancing these different interests and solutions to address the different aspects of this cluster of problems which are there in the context that we are talking about. So every policy has this three key elements or problems, in a sense that it has to have this clear definition of the problem which it is trying to address to. It has to have this clear goal agenda which it is trying to achieve, and also the policy instrumentalities or instruments to address the problem and to achieve that goal has to be very, very clear. And I'm talking about the very formal aspect of policy, which is, planned policy documents emanating from the government. But also there is that informal policy, which is ad hoc, which is unwritten, but is also which is widely recognized and practiced and understood within the organization and is followed whenever any kind of decisions are taken. And as I said, policy making involves large number of people, from government ministries to officials to apex government organizations to this informal non-elected officials, trade unions, lobbies, various organizations, media, think tanks are heavily invested and sort of engaged in the processes of policy making. Whenever we study public policy, we have to understand that policy making is not a one-time action taken. It is in fact very cyclical. It's a kind of a cycle which the public policy follows. And public policy development is in fact termed to be an iterative process rather than linear one. And if I have to just spell out the key phases which result in the public policy, it is like we need to know where the problem has emanated from. Then we need to place the problem on the government agenda in order to find a solution. We need to have this formulation of various alternatives to solve the problem. Then we need to adopt that policy, and next we have to implement, and then last but not the least, we have to be able to evaluate that policy. So in reality, the process is less orderly, it's more chaotic, it's more incremental rather than in the sequence that I have just listed out in front of you. Then there is something called policy instruments that I just briefly mentioned before. So policy instruments are techniques at the disposal of the government to implement policy objectives. So after the issue or problem is defined, the tools are formed to achieve the desired outcomes. And the purpose of the policy instruments are basically to achieve behavioral change within individuals, to realize the social, political, economic conditions, and provide services to the public. I'm giving you a broad overview about what is policy making, what are the policy steps, who are the actors involved. But just actually to tell you that this is a very interesting paper and subject which brings in a lot of multidisciplinarity, because when we talk about policy, we are, as we know, that we're existing in the era of globalization. So monetary policy, fiscal policy, trade policy, health policy, education policy, all these are the aspects of policy making, and the subject itself would involve some kind of a specialized, technical information about how to deal with or how to frame a policy to deal with some of these very, very, complex problems of the modern society. So the subject itself becomes very, very, contemporary. It becomes very, very topical, because just look at the pandemic, and when we talk about the health policy, perhaps COVID-19 would be a big example of how policy synchronization from the local to the global was needed to handle this kind of health crisis which emerged in a year and which had a spiraling impact on not only on the health of the people, but on the economy, travel, and almost all the sectors. I just personally feel that over the course of the years, the policy making subject and specialization is going to get more significance, more attention from the stakeholders, because we would need more expert information, data analysis, inputs of more correct inputs to deal with these problems, rather than leaving the policy making itself completely in the hands of the politicians or to the bureaucrats. So I would say that policy making in the future would involve many specialists who have deep knowledge about how to tackle a problem. This could be a practitioner or an academician or a think tank or a researcher who would have to work closely with the government sector to resolve some of these problems. Otherwise, we'll be, as they say, making policies in the ivory tower, which is totally disconnected with the reality or the needs of the consumers or the citizens or the solutions which they are looking for. So this was my just brief, talk about policy and why the subject is gaining so much of significance in the current times. I'm sure that many of you in the future are going to take up this subject to get that, academic, theoretical underpinnings and information, and also run through multiple case studies of how good policies are actually made and have been successful in achieving those outcomes. Thank you.